and I'm going to let everyone in. Tamara? Oh, I don't think we can hear you. Hello, everyone. Welcome. While we get Tamara set up here, I'm just going to welcome you to our lunch and learn today about covering the history of adoption. Tamara, I'm going to see if you're ready to, I saw you took off your headphones. You'll see in the chat, we've got some information asking for your name, if you wouldn't mind stating your name and also where you're joining from. And if you are interested in being put on our list to receive more information for our future events, more lunch and learns, we've got some book clubs going on, and we've got other exciting things coming up. So if you are interested in being a part of receiving more information, please go ahead and put your email address in the chat and we will add you to the list unless you're already on that list. Then thank you so much for joining us today. I am Dr. Bunny Goodwin and I work with the University of Oklahoma, but most of my time and my heart is spent with child welfare as the statewide coordinator of adoption preservation services. So I am so grateful to welcome you all today. And I'm going to mute and turn it over to our wonderful team who is going to share about the history of adoption. Lynn Smith and Dominique Carter are running the show today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for coming in. We appreciate everyone for joining. We want to get started so we can make sure to respect everyone's time and the great information that we're going to be sharing with you today. Let's go over a few housekeeping things at the very beginning. We are recording this meeting, so by participating, you are giving your consent to be recorded. Help us reduce distractions so we can all focus and participate. We have muted everyone to make it possible for everyone to hear the presentation. We want to see you, so if you're willing and you can, so please turn on your video. If you're unable, that is fine also. Also, at the end of the training, we will provide you with a survey link that we'd like for you to complete. This provides us with the opportunity to be able to receive feedback on today's presentation. And if you are an open resource home, please complete this survey. There's a question in there that will let us know that you are an open resource home. And by attending this training today, you will be able to receive 1 hour of training credit towards the 12 hours of in-service training that you need every year. I hope everyone is enjoying their lunch, and out of respect for your time, we want to head on, get everything going and get it started. Today, just like Dr. Bonnie discussed, we will be discussing the history of adoption. My name is Lynn Smith. I am currently an OU Masters of Social Work student in practicum within post-adoptions at Oklahoma Human Services. I have worked within the child welfare field for over 10 years, currently as a supervisor in foster care recruitment. My co-host today will be Dominique Carter, and I will let him introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dominic Carter. As she did state, I'm also a student at the University of Oklahoma pursuing my master's in social work as well. And I have 9 years of experience. I've worked in child protective services. I've also worked in permanency planning, and my current position is an education specialist. And I serve with youth who are transitioning out of foster care or who've been adopted, transitioning into post-secondary education by providing a scholarship for them to help assist with financial resources for post-secondary education.
Thank you, Dominique. Now, moving forward for the short hour that we have together, we will be looking at a brief but detailed history of adoption and how we can move forward to improve upon the past and build a new and better future for individuals impacted by adoption. This would include adoptees, adoptive parents, bio families, extended families, and especially professionals in the field, including teachers, medical personnel, mental health providers, coaches, anyone that has um, interactions and direct contact with families individually or as a unit. So, moving on.
So for today's objectives, we will talk about adoption competency and the lens in which we view adoption competency and how important it is to understand the 18 domains and how to best serve those youth, families, adoptive families, and adoptees in the regard of adoption competency. We will also talk about the types of adoption and how that impacts those individuals in that realm. And then we will focus on primarily today on the adoption history from the 18th century to present. And I'll read a quote here from Henry Glassy. History is not the past, but the map to the past drawn from a particular point of view to be useful for the modern traveler. So in our previous Lunch and Learn, our team discussed and defined adoption competency and its impact on adoptive families, post-adoptive families, adoptees, and biological families, along with professionals whom adoption impacts. So there are 18 domains of adoption competencies, and we'll take a look at them in the next slide. In all of the research with adoptive families the past decade, finding someone who gets it, who understands adoption and what that looks like when working with these families, but also understanding the unique challenges and complexities of adoption, making their work with families sometimes potentially incomplete or even harmful if they do not understand what adoption competency is, what that looks like, and how to address those concerns with those individual families and those children. This is why understanding adoption competency is very critical for both professionals, parents, adoptees, and biological families that are also assisting in the transition. So as we did state, understanding the history of adoption, we have to understand adoption competency in order to be able to serve the youth. So today we won't be going through the entire 18 competencies. However, what we will do is focus primarily today on the history of adoption and the processes of adoption to be able to understand how we've come to today's presentation. So when understanding adoption competency, we understand that these 18 competencies, they overlap, they weave together, and it's very important to understand each unique characteristic about adoption that must be viewed through a specific lens, which professionals approach in their work, but also understanding youth in the process as well, because every experience that an individual has, it's their expertise. So we want to be able to understand them from their point of view to be able to address whatever concerns they may have, whether it be able to address loss and trauma or loss and grief, be able to address trauma. So what we're going to do is we're talking about the major pillar today, which is going to be the history of adoption. So when we address the history of adoption, there's one thing that we have to focus on, which is bonding and attachment. So there are several activities that we have outlined that allows us to be able to build that bond and connection with young people who have experienced adoption. And for younger children, one activity that we have focused on is more so of kind of a staring game. So this activity takes about 2 or 3 minutes that you can work directly with your child. And we typically advise the parents that we're working with. This is something that you can do often with that child because it builds that bonding connection. So if they make a noise or if they cry, for those individuals that are under a specific age, just them being acknowledged that they exist, or being able to, find a bottle because they're hungry, or being able to change their diaper, that is a bond and attachment because they know that you see that they are there and that they are present. With older children, mirror matching is a very good activity to be able to work with those young people. If they make a funny face or they laugh, or just kind of having that moment with them where they can actually take the lead, because many children are being told what to do and not necessarily given the opportunity to be a lead. So knowing that they have a voice in that conversation, in that relationship, is very important. So for other activities, those are ones that we expressed in our previous training. For this specific training here, we'll outline two other ones, which is the remember game. And for younger children, just kind of having a time where you can sit down either at dinner time or you can have a seat at the dinner table, and just allowing them to express different experiences that they've had, whether it be in the foster care system or experience with another foster child that they have been placed with at some point in time. Just giving them an opportunity to tell their story. And also you can create a life book in this process with them. So if you're doing it at dinner time, just being able to collect those pictures or those memories, being able to write them down with that child, it gives them an opportunity to be able to go back and visit those stories and those memories with you. And that is a moment where you can build that emotional bond and connection with the child. And then with older children, another activity, I've worked in child welfare, as I stated before. A lot of my conversations came in the car with some of my older youth that I've served, just giving them an opportunity just to be able to kind of tell their story as far as how was their day? What did that look like? What are their expectations moving forward? And what would they like to see in their life? So it just gives them an opportunity to open up the dialogue and kind of state where they would like to be in their perspective in regard to their story.
I'm sorry, I was steady talking and I was muted. I'm sorry. So now we are going through to the types of adoptions. As we all know, there are many different situations that can lead to an adoption occurring within a child's life. According to the Children's Bureau for Children and Families, there are two types of adoption: domestic adoption, public agency adoption, which is listed up under the domestic adoption, which a lot of us are familiar with, are children coming in from the child welfare system. We have the private agency adoption, where the bio parent is working with the agency to find a family. We have an independent adoption, through which a private attorney is working with the family and there's no agency that is involved. And then also we have the international or inter-country adoption. That is the Hague Convention country adoption and a non-Hague Convention country adoption. Let me explain what Hague means. The Hague Convention is a treaty that provides safeguards to protect the best interests of the child, birth parents, and adoptive parents in international or inter-country adoptions. That includes regulations on eligibility, forms that need to be completed, and then also the adoption process as a whole. And currently, the United States recognizes more than 100 countries as part of that treaty. Now, let's start down the road of the history around adoption. The first place I wanted to start was with the word adoption. Let's first look at it and its origins. During research, it was found in the online etymology, which is a language and word dictionary, that the first records of the word adoption came from about the 1300s. That adoption is a noun form of the verb adopt, which comes from the Latin verb adoptere, meaning to choose for oneself. And optere, which is the root of that word, means to choose. So, in reviewing ancient history, it shows that the ancient Mesopotamians wrote detailed family laws that included adoption laws and contracts that upheld the rights and interests of both the adopted child and the adoptive parents of the child. These laws were documented and sealed on tablets. On the screen there on your left, you will see an original ancient Mesopotamian adoption agreement written on a tablet. Now let's move forward a little bit to 1750 BC. The Code of Hammurabi in ancient Babylonia included the rights and the responsibilities of both the adoptees and their adoptive families in details. Now, the law has been translated as stating that craftsmen should train their adoptive sons as their own apprentices. This law even allowed unmarried women to adopt, as well as indentured slaves to be adopted as part of the family. I have documented a part of the law, which is Law 185, and it has been translated as stating that if a man adopt a child and to his name as son and rear him, this grown son cannot be demanded back again. Now we're going to take another leap, moving forward to 400 AD in ancient Rome. Adoption was a common practice as a way of creating and solidifying family ties among the wealthy and political families. And it was also a way that was used to ensure a peaceful from transition in power from one emperor to the next. The World History Encyclopedia even stated only a handful of emperors were related by blood to their predecessor. So adoptions at this time had taken a little bit of a evolutionary step in regards to it was at this point being politically motivated.
All right, so we're going to take a jump to the 17th to the 19th century in the Middle Ages. And um, in contrast to ancient Rome, the Europeans' nobility gave attention to the continuum of the family bloodline, mainly for the purposes of inheritance. In 1693, Sir Williams Phillips, who was the governor Providence of Massachusetts Bay, adopted a child. It became one of the earliest known record instances of adoption in European history. In 1729, the first orphanage in the United States was established at a covenant in New Orleans ran by nuns in the Ninth Ward. The orphanage was established to care for white children orphaned by a conflict between Indians and whites. Some theorize these orphans were established in response to the health epidemic, which is tuberculosis and influenza, and also the war, influx of immigration into particular geographic locations, growing urbanizations, and the poor economic times. Others theorize that this establishment of these institutions were for a variety of other reasons, and these were to control the poor and also the need for child labor. In 1851, the state of Massachusetts passed its first modern law on adoption, the Massachusetts Adoption of Children Act. It recognized adoption as a legal and social procedure based on the welfare of children rather than the interest of the adult parties involved. We're going to watch a short clip here. I believe it's about 5 or 6 minutes, but it talks about Charles Loring Brace and the orphan trains. So if you all would brace yourselves for about 6 minutes here, we'll watch this and then we'll move forward.
In the 1800s, the railroads faced a problem. Farm labor shortages along their newly expanded westward lines threatened profitability. Not surprisingly, in 1853, they jumped at the chance to support a New York City minister's idea, an early version of foster care that would find homes for the city's orphans on farms in the Midwest.
They were told, your parents are not your parents, your past is not your past, your life begins when you are chosen. The orphan trains began because a Methodist minister in New York City named Charles Loring Brace looked around the streets of New York and saw that there were 30,000 children living on the streets. They were getting run over, dying of starvation and exposure, going to jail, becoming criminals, they were becoming prostitutes. What we think of as Dickensian London is really what it was like then for poor people. Immigrants were pouring in, the Industrial Revolution was replacing jobs for poor people with machines, the Civil War was raging and creating vulnerable war widows. So there are many reasons that there were all these children on the streets. And Brace had this idea, it was sort of a glorified fresh air fund. He thought, if I can get children off the streets and send them to farms in the Midwest where labor is needed, maybe we can save their lives and maybe we can clean up the streets of New York. He worked with the train companies to send children on trains to the Midwest, and the trains each held between 10 and 30 children. And over the course of the next 75 years, over 250,000 children were sent to the Midwest. There were two ways that people got children from the orphan trains. The Foundling Hospital, which got into the act a little bit later, would put notices in newspapers around the Midwest, and people would write in and say, I'd like a blonde, curly-haired, blue-eyed, 7-year-old boy with a sweet disposition. And so they would look around and find that child and put him on a train, and then that person would be waiting on the other end. The Children's Aid Society had the children line up by height at a train platform or at a city hall or a Grange hall. Then farmers or whoever came would often, not unlike a slave auction, have them run in place, check their teeth, check their muscles, have them do even sit-ups or push-ups to make sure they were strong because they wanted workers. The farmers would take them off the stage and then fill out certificates taking ownership of the child. Contracts were signed between the people who took the train riders in and the organization, the Children's Aid Society or the Foundling Hospital, and it says, shall be indentured until the age of 21. These children were 2 to 14 years old. 21 is quite a long time to be working for someone else. The people who took in the train riders were required to send them to school, 4 months of schooling a year, to feed and clothe them. There was some language about treating them as you would one of your own. However, they were labor. For some of them, it was actually a form of slavery. Many of them had no choice but do what they were told to do. There were volunteers in communities who were supposed to check in on the children. That was rather spotty as a process. For one thing, they were volunteers. And because children were property, even if someone went out to check on a situation, it was much more likely that the adults would be believed than that the child would be believed. Furthermore, there was a great disincentive to take children out of homes because it was so hard then to know what to do with them. And so they would often leave children in situations that were not really the best for them. It was an imperfect system, and what it meant is that it was absolutely a roulette wheel. And the children had no choice about where they were going, and the people who took in the train riders were as varied as human nature. There were very good people, very kind people who took in train riders, and there were also people who weren't so good and kind. Even if the people who took them in were kind, they often treated them as a little bit less than family. One of the reasons we don't know much, that most people don't know much about the orphan trains, is that the train riders themselves didn't realize that they were part of this large movement. 250,000 children go on these trains, and most of them think that their train was the only one that went. So you can see why they didn't organize more quickly or reach out to each other. I was so lucky. When I began this book, there were 150 living train riders. Today, there are probably between 10 and 20. It was such a gift. I had access to living train riders and could interview them. One of the most significant was a woman named Pat Thiessen. Even at the age of 93, she felt the loss and the sort of sorrow. She said, they were good people, but they were not my people. As one train rider said to me, you know, we had been through so much turmoil and so much trauma. Every child who rode the orphan train had been through something terrible. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been there because the trains were the last resort.
So moving forward a little bit, we have the orphan trains that were going. Now we have in 1921, the Child Welfare League of America was created, leading change around child placing policies, standards of record keeping, personnel training, and also placement practices. 1948, we have the first recorded adoption of an African American child placed in a white home that took place in Minnesota. But simultaneously, it was still against social norms for white children to be adopted and raised in non-white homes. 1953 was first nationally coordinated effort to locate adoptive homes for African American children. The National Urban League Foster Care and Adoption Project was the leader of this project. For a good part of the 20th century, African American birth parents and children were denied adoption services by agencies because of their religion, race, or a combination of both. African Americans had to rely instead on traditions of informal adoptions, basically to take care of their own. Between the 1930s to about 1965, it was estimated that 50,000 African American children were in need of adoption. During the 1950s, the U.S. Children's Bureau, that was established by Congress in 1912, initiated a number of programs around the country to begin recruiting non-white um, adoptive parents. Also in 1953, the March, which is the Minority Adoption Recruitment of Children's Homes in San Francisco, recorded a high number of Chinese, Filipino, Hawaiian, Japanese, Korean, Samoan, and American Indian children reported as needing services on their caseloads. It was documented at the Department of History at the University of Oregon in the year 1970 that adoptions reached a historical high of 175,000 children that year, with around a documented guess of around 2,500 transracial adoptions occurring within the same year. And I say historical guess is because when I was doing the research on this information, I found different numbers, and it was just due to the fact that the recording of adoptions by race was not really enforced until 1948. And as we all know, sometimes the trickle down of who is recording and how people are recording, and especially during that time, it may have taken a little bit longer for the records to be accurate.
All right, so next we'll talk about the Indian Child Welfare Act. We'll play a clip first, and then I will give a brief history about it, and then we have one clip following that.
Everybody that comes to love me, I always say, well, who are you and what are you doing here and how come you're here and away from home? What do you want? And I do that to everybody, no matter who they are. I guess because we've been hurt so many times in our lives as Native people, and we have the mistrust. You have to gain your trust in order for some of us to speak. We were forbid to do our traditional beliefs, and our people were put in jail for practicing our belief. it's not an easy thing to talk about. We were forced to go to school. The kids were pulled out of their homes. Some of them not even knowing, the families not even knowing where their children were. The churches and the government took our kids and put them in foster care, foster homes.
I grew up knowing the terrible history that the U.S. has with its indigenous people and my family. After centuries of stolen land and genocide, our people did not die out. We survived. An obstacle to manifest destiny. So the U.S. came up with a solution to get rid of us. Absorb and assimilate.
On the one hand, we have the Navajo as we find him in the desert. Few of these boys and girls have ever seen a white man. Yet, through the agencies of the government, they are being rapidly brought from their state of comparative savagery and barbarism to one of civilization.
John Brown, hello, is there John Brown? Hello, is there John Brown? Hello, is there one?
The Indian Adoption Project began in 1958 as a government effort to remove Native children from their families and place them in white homes.
For decades, Indian parents and their children have been at the mercy of abusive action of local, state, federal, and private agency officials.
Between 25 and 35% of all American Indian children are removed from their families.
Welfare agencies seem to have operated on the premise that most Indian children would really be better off growing up non-Indian. It has been called by some cultural genocide.
All right, so they've given quite a bit of history there, but we'll talk about the Child Welfare, the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978. Prior to this act being put into law, between the 1880s and the 1930s, the policy in the United States towards indigenous people was assimilation into white society by stripping them of their language, spiritual beliefs, foods, traditions, and families' lives were considered uncivilized. So missionaries and governments opened up boarding schools on and off reservations, forcing children to abandon their traditions. These actions of the United States government was identified as a cultural genocide, as stated in the video. The culture couldn't survive without the children being able to carry on their traditions. Children who were forced into these schools were abused physically, mentally, emotionally, and also sexually. This act was created to help protect the best interests of indigenous people and promote the federal standard for the removal of indigenous people and placing preference with indigenous families or other indigenous people, which is other indigenous tribes, to maintain their sovereign rights and also legal powers. We have one other video that's going to talk about the legal ramifications of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And currently there is a debate in the Supreme Court whether or not to overturn the Indian Child Welfare Act based on it being an act that is based on race or talks about sovereignty. So that is about 3 minutes.
My name is Stacy Lara, and I'm an assistant teaching professor at the University of Washington School of Law.
Can you give a brief overview of the Indian Child Welfare Act?
The Indian Child Welfare Act was passed in 1978 in response to the really egregious and tragic practice of unnecessary removal of Indian children from their families and their communities. The Indian Child Welfare Act was put in place to address this reality and to, in its passage, create certain protections for Indian children to remain in their homes. These include notice, so tribes getting notice when one of their children have been removed from their family's home, It sets higher standards for service provision. So child welfare agencies or a third party looking to adopt a child needs to make active efforts to keep the family intact before removal and to try and return that child home as soon as possible. It also creates higher standards of proof and creates a remedy in that it allows for the invalidation of a termination of parental rights if the law is not complied with.
What are the issues concerning Brackeen versus Holland?
So this case presents three primary issues to the Supreme Court. The first is whether ICWA unconstitutionally discriminates on the basis of race by requiring state proceedings to give preference in its placement of Indian children with that child's extended family, other members of the tribe, or Indian families rather than non-Indian adoptive parents. The second is whether ICWA and its implementing regulations constitutionally commandeer states or otherwise exceed Congress's authority. And then the third is whether the authority that ICWA confers upon individual Indian tribes violates the non-delegation doctrine.
What are the arguments for both sides of the case?
Well, under the equal protection argument, and it involves placement preferences that are a component of ICWA. The Brackeen argument is that because ICWA applies to Indian children, it's a race-based classification. Many states are taking the position that ICWA is not about race. It doesn't apply because it's not based on racial identification. Tribal membership or enrollment is determined by the tribes themselves, and it is a political designation, and that was established under Morton versus Mancari. On anti-commandeering, that doctrine, the Brackeen argument, is that ICWA requires state agencies to spend money and resources, and in doing that, it commandeers state governments, which would be a violation of anti-commandeering. The response is that ICWA sets minimum legal burdens, and that if Congress has the power to pass a law, it also has the power to require state judges to comply with and enforce it. And then with respect to the non-delegation doctrine, the Brackeen position is that Congress improperly delegates placement preferences to tribes. The response being that tribes are not administrative agencies, they're not private persons, they're separate sovereigns that have a sovereign-to-sovereign relationship with the United States government, and therefore that the delegation doctrine doesn't apply.
Can you explain what the decision might mean for federal Indian law and tribal sovereignty?
One commentator has said that this case could have revolutionary and catastrophic consequences, and I absolutely agree with that. There are hundreds of treaties that the federal government has made with Indian nations that are in effect, and whether or not these can stand based on whether or not this law is considered unconstitutional really remains to be seen. If Congress can't distinguish between tribal members and non-members, that has the real potential to impact future litigation involving Native tribes. It could impact gaming revenue, gaming rights, mineral rights, tribal recognition, really undermining Native sovereignty, which has been in place since the very first days of this country.
So after watching that video, if you have any comments or concerns that you would like to discuss towards the end of the presentation, definitely put that out there. I'll just kind of make note of one is that it said that out of 374 different treaties already established with this several or different tribes throughout the United States. So that definitely kind of stood out, but we'll transition to the late 20th century here.
Okay, moving on, I'm going to jump a little bit to 1994. We have the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, which is the first federal law that prohibited agencies from receiving federal funds for denying transracial adoptions. 1996, we have the Inter-Ethnic Adoption Amendment, which is an amendment to the 1994 MEPA, Multi-Ethnic Placement Act that I just discussed. It was revised and made it impermissible to employ race at all within the adoption process. Then we have 1997, the Adoption and Safe Families Act. It was an act that enacted the health and safety of the child as paramount and very important through the adoption process, changing the view of also reunification. Then we have 2000, the Child Citizenship Act. It allowed certain foreign-born adoptees to automatically become U.S. citizens eliminating the legal process. As we have discussed today, we've gone through a little bit of very, very brief touch on the history of adoption. And when I say very brief, it is extremely brief, because throughout history, there are a lot of dates. There are a lot of things that have changed. One thing about adoption throughout history has changed as society has changed and laws change. We go through the history, we find that adoption was influenced by nobility, politics, wealth, bloodline, and race, and all of these factors leading to oppression and discrimination within adoption practices within the US.
So moving, I would kind of be remiss if I didn't necessarily talk about grief and loss in this process, because we understand that any time a child is removed, they experience adverse childhood experiences. And through that process of grief and loss, we know that these experiences could definitely be overshadowed if they're not addressed, and they could be perceived as symptoms of various mental health diagnoses. So with adoption competency professionals and also parents and individuals who serve adoptive families, post-adoptive families, and biological families, this gives them the opportunity to be able to employ specific techniques to be able to work with those youth, work with those families, to be able to help understand those loss and trauma in the process and navigate through that grief, which is why it's important to kind of understand those 18 domains of adoption competency. We've only focused on the history today, but as we stated previously, we have a previous recording of adoption competency, and the objective is to provide more information to help enhance the education around adoption competency as we move forward through this process.
Now, moving to the future of adoption. The future of adoption basically relies on all of us and every person that has been touched by adoption, whether in their professional life or in their personal life. Adoption competency helps to address the issues created by the past within adoption. And also, as we shared a video on the the Bracken and Holland case, there are upcoming changes. So please stay informed, because all of this information is very, very important and pertinent to the progression of adoption and where we go from here. So we're nearing the end of our time today, but before we end, we want to address any questions that were put into the chat or any questions that anyone has at this time. So please type your questions into the chat and we will try our best to answer them or direct you in a place to where we can find your answers and we can be of support. So do we have any in the chat? Any questions or anything that came through, Toya?
Nope, not at this time. We have not.
Okay. Thank you so much.
We do have some good discussion and some responses to different things in the chat as well. And one thing I just wanted to point out, first of all, way to go, Lynn and Dominique. Thank you guys so much. It was an incredible presentation. I learned something, and I've been studying adoption for a long time. So I am super, super impressed and grateful. We do have a question now in the chat. Do we know what state originated with the ICWA Supreme Court case? And Christy is fast on the draw, responding with Texas, that it originated from Texas. Hey, Lynn, I'm wondering if we can stop sharing screen so we can see everybody's face. Awesome, thank you. I also welcome you to unmute if you are interested, and I'd love to hear just reactions or thoughts of like, what does this mean? Lynn and Dominique have done a fantastic job of telling us what it means in the understanding of adoption as a whole. But what has it meant to you listening? Did you learn something? Was there something that you had not heard before?
Well, the parallel between the orphan trains and slavery.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And the impact of what I think when you study the orphan trains and you think about the impact of the orphan trains, we look back at some of this history, and a lot of times you can see that it came from a desire to help, right? Like it came from this sense of there's a lot of children out here that need something better than they have. But it was just we don't always have the full capacity to understand the unintended consequences of the things that we do. And I think that's the most important thing about looking back at the history, is that we can see, oh, wait, you know what? We were trying really hard there, but we missed all this stuff that actually really created a lot of harm. And so then we learn from it, and we've changed a lot of things, but we still have things to change. We still have things to learn. And I think that's the most important aspect, and why adoption history is one of the competencies within the 18 of adoption competent understanding. Is we have to always be aware of what we've done, what didn't work, and then how we need to adjust, and how we need to really support identity formation. That's, I mean, the beautiful thing, the more in depth we go about adoption competency, the more you see that they all weave together and everything is important. All 18 areas that if you remember that slide, that big picture of the lens that you look through, because a history, what we've learned from those things that we went over today, helps us understand how important it is for us to tell a child their history, tell a child where they come from, what their cultural background is, celebrate that, honor that, and help them weave it into their identity formation and who they are. And also be aware of that there's potential for some additional trauma just from realizing when we do learn these things. Education is a big deal for our adopted kids. And when they learn some of these historical things that our country has been through in the adoption process, even if it's not specifically talking about adoption, it can hit with our kids and be like, oh wait, what does that mean for me? So being able to have that full picture and understand how all these things weave together is so important. Thank you, Ray. Anyone else?
I don't know if anyone caught in one of the videos, one of the individuals stated that their past didn't matter, that when they were selected is when their life began. And that, I think Dr. already mentioned it, as far as like identifying their past and who they are before before they've transitioned to adoption. So I thought that was very interesting that it was presented in that manner, that they couldn't find their history. They didn't know where they come from, who they were, and that it only started when they started working in some of the fields and doing service for some of the other farms.
In doing the research, I was really able to see the switch from adoption throughout history, going from protection of the child, working within the family, to a political, to basically bloodlines, to race, to politics, and it was a nice way of looking and seeing the evolution of saying, okay, now we're at adoption competency. We're looking at all of these things that have influenced adoption throughout the year, but within adoption competency in those 18 domains, we're able to address all of the trauma, all of the misbelief, the language, the exclusive policies, laws, thoughts, procedures within adoption to really be there for the adoptive family, for the adopted child, and for the bio parents. You want to build that triad of good communication, support, encouraging environments, and professionals that can work in the field and be there for the family the way that they need to, in alignment with those adoption competency, the 18 domains.
I was just going to say one of my biggest things is that adoption historically, and is still a problem now, has always been to meet the adoptive parents' needs and not the other way around. I work for a foster care agency, and so a lot of people come to us, and that's what they're coming to meet their needs, complete their family. And so historically it was like, well, we need child labor, we need political things, whatever it is. And I mean, that is the one thing, if I could change about adoption, is to start looking at adoption should only be to meet the needs of the child's in need of adoption, and not the other way around.
And I think this was really good to like see and understand why, like in child welfare and permanency, we have a lot of children, especially our teenagers, who will refuse the option of adoption. Like they don't want it. And we try to keep pushing, we try to keep talking. And I think this is really helpful to just stop and try to like understand and respect that, it's not their people, they want their people.
Yes.
And that was a really strong point for me.
Well, and it talks about, to your point, Catherine, a lot of times in our experience in child welfare, when we get to that point, when they turn 18 or they age out or whatever the case may be, or get adopted or whatever, and a lot of times when they become an adult, they'll return back to their parents originally, whatever condition that may or may not be in. So that happens more often than not, but I know that's a lot to do with the connection they have with their family, and that has a lot to do with like the historical trauma of everything, and and so they're just trying to relate back to what they know and how they were able to do that. So.
Yeah, such good thoughts. And I just want to go back a minute to Sandy's comment about that. So often we're thinking in the history of adoption, we've looked at the needs of the adoptive parents, especially if you're looking at the orphan trains and they're like, I would like a blonde, blue-eyed 7-year-old male, and shifting it to thinking more of the child's needs, which I think has been a big, major, and pretty pervasive shift now. I've worked in a private adoption agency. I've worked with child welfare for the past 20 years. And that's really been a thing that's important to everyone now, is look at the child first. I think another thing I just want to add to that is the entity. Lynn mentioned the triad. We talk about adoptive parents, adopted child, and biological family. And most often, the biological family is really totally left out of the conversation, right? And some of that is understandable, because with when a child has been in foster care, then there's some reasons why biological family is not always included in the conversation when the child is then exiting foster care for adoption. But the problem with us totally leaving them out is that impacts the development of the child. That child, so many kids that I've worked with in private practice, not private practice, I'm sorry, in therapy with who have been adopted. I can't think of a child who was not processing where I come from. Like Catherine, you said that my people, right? And understanding their blood is in me. I mean, I've heard so many kids talk about that. If they don't know who their biological family members are, and if those biological family members are not spoken of in an honest, but then also a respectful way, then that language is a part of the process of identity formation of who I am. And I've had many, many children, really, like one kiddo I can tell you about specifically. She didn't know she was adopted for a significant chunk of her life, about 8 years, until she found her adoption papers. And when she started asking questions to find out, more about her story of why was I placed for adoption, why am I here? The response that she was given out of fear, it's an understandable place. The adoptive parents kept telling her, it's so bad you don't want to know, because they were trying to protect her. They thought it would hurt more. But then that became such a destructive thought inside of this kid, where she then filled in the pieces of the puzzle that she didn't have with the information that she would assume. And so she thought, if it's so bad I can't know, then I'm going to go to the worst possible thing humans do, and that is a serial killer. So my biological family must be full of a bunch of serial killers. So then what does that mean for me? I'm evil. That blood is in me. And so then what do kids do? A lot of self-destructive behavior. And so it was very, very challenging for us to stabilize her, to stop the self-harming, the self-destruction, to help her to just take a breath long enough to be able to hear us help her process through some of the gaps in her story and start to come up with all other alternatives. So that's another big piece to this, is understanding the whole triad. I see, Lynn, you put that beautiful graphic in the chat. Could you explain more of what that is?
In doing a little bit of research, I found this as the adoption symbol. The adoption symbol is a very complex, basically what it is the essence that adoption surrounds three essential groups of people. It is the birth parents, the adoptive parents, and the adoptee. The symbol is represented by a triangle intertwined with a heart. The adoptee occupies the topmost point, while the birth parents and adoptive parents take up the bottom 2 points. So it signifies that both the birth parents and the adoptive parents are placing the adoptees, which is the child's, interest above their own, and that the adoptee in theory shares same communication with adoptive parents, birth parents. So we have a triangle with the heart. So I wanted to put that in there as Dr. Bonnie Goodwin was speaking about the triad and how important that triad is. We are at 12:58, so I put the link to the survey in the chat. Please complete the survey for us so we can receive feedback, know different topics that you would like to discuss in regards to adoption competency. And we do have other events coming up, and there has been a link put into the chat that Toya put into the chat for OK Fosters. That website has all of our events that are coming up that we'll be discussing adoption competency, that will be discussing trauma, that we'll be discussing. We also have book clubs that we're doing. We're going to be creating support groups for post-adoptive families. So we have a lot of things coming. So once you click on that link, keep and bookmark that page, because it's going to be a whole bunch more stuff coming, and we really truly enjoy everyone that came out today. Is there anything else you would like to say, Dominique or Bonnie, in closing?
Just thank you to everyone who showed up. If you have any questions, definitely reach out to us. And if you all have any ideas or things that you would like to learn more in regard to adoption, definitely let us know and we'll do our best to get that information out to you.
Same here. Thank you guys so very much. It was a great conversation. And again, good job, Lynn and Dominique. Fantastic. It was great information. Appreciate it.
It's 12:59. We are there. Everybody enjoy the rest of your lunch. Thank you.
Have a good day.